All right. It looks like most people have filed into the room, the Zoom room. Thanks a lot for coming today. As I said, my name is Clayton Sinyal. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Labor Network. The Catholic Labor Network is an association of Catholic trade unionists and Catholic clergy, religious, and lay social justice advocates who promote Catholic social teaching on labor and work. We are pleased to have a wonderful panel here today for this program on the 35th anniversary of Economic Justice for All. We're going to hear from Father David Hollenbach of Georgetown University, who was involved in drafting the document. We'll hear from Dr. Meghan Clark from St. John's University, and we will hear from Roxana Bendezu of Pax Christi and Migrant Roots Media. So this is, as we have mentioned, the 35th anniversary of the release of that document in November of 1986. This pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, really struck me when it came out. I was a young man at the time and was excited to see the leaders of my church wrestling in a very detailed way with the policies, the economic and social policies of my country in light of gospel values and the traditional Catholic social teaching of the church. So with that, I don't want to take up a lot of your time, a lot of the guest time. I want to put them on the stage. I'd like to turn this over to Father David Hollenbach to tell us a bit about the origins of the document and its initial reception. So, Father David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clayton. It's a very great pleasure to be with you all and talking about this issue, which means a lot to me. It meant a lot to me 35 years ago, and I can't believe it's been 35 years, but it seems to have been, and it still means a good bit to me today. Let me just tell you a little bit about the background of the drafting of the document. My role was as a consultant to the Bishops' Committee. There was a committee of 5 United States bishops, chaired by Archbishop Rembert Weekland of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, along with 4 other bishops. And they had been charged with drafting a document on capitalism and the response of the church to capitalism, because a little bit earlier, the bishops had issued a document on Marxism. And so they had decided that they should move in the direction of addressing not only Marxism, but also the system prevailing in the United States, namely capitalism. As they began to move into the process, however, they decided that they wanted to become more concrete than talking about a theoretical issue or a more ideological framework about capitalism, and to address a series of concrete questions. In particular, they were particularly concerned about some of the Reagan administration policies which were prevailing at the time. At the time the document was drafted, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, adopting a very strongly free market, liberalist kind of orientation toward the structure, and cutting back on welfare issues, basically not worrying much about unemployment. And the unemployment rate in the United States was very high. There was rising poverty. And so they decided to focus on 2 particular domestic issues, namely poverty and unemployment. That got broadened as the discussion went on to include agriculture in the United States. And they were also going to talk about planning, about how to bring planning into the concern about how the economy was dealt with. But they decided not to do that, but to address rather some of the issues about the role of different organizations in influencing the economy. They also decided that they wanted to say something about the international connections of the United States economy, and therefore there's a chapter in there about global connections and so forth. Now, a couple of issues that were really coming to the fore at the time that were really quite remarkable about the document. Um, Early on, the bishops decided that they were going to begin consulting with a variety of groups on the American scene to get their input about how the church should respond to the economic questions. The level of consultation that the bishops' committee of 5 bishops conducted over the course of almost 2 full years was really quite extraordinary. They met with labor groups, members of labor unions. They met with leaders of large American corporations. They met with academics from various settings in the United States. They met with groups from outside the United States. There was one major meeting where they met with a group of Latin American bishops, because one of the things they were particularly concerned about was, and this had been raised by Latin American bishops, about the impact of the US economy on the developing world, and in particular on Latin America. So that consultation was really quite broad, and it included people who were both supportive of the direction in which the bishops eventually moved, but also some people who were critics of the direction which the bishops took. And so among those consulted were people like Michael Novak, who became a particularly strong critic of the document after the first draft was issued. They issued the document in several stages. The first draft of it came out in 1984. They did several revisions, and then the final draft appeared in 1986. And this was 1984. They put the draft out, the first draft, shortly after Ronald Reagan had been reelected president of the United States. There was a big debate about whether to issue it before the election, but they decided that if they did that, they would be accused of being excessively politically involved, and decided to wait until after the election and issued it thereafter. However, the response to the draft when it came out was really very powerful. The New York Times covered it as the lead story on the front page of the newspaper after the day after the first draft came out, including a picture of Archbishop Weekland on the front page and an extensive discussion of the contents of the letter. In addition, the chief economic correspondent for the business page of the New York Times, a man named Leonard Silk, who was a highly regarded journalist on economic issues, wrote a column about the economics pastoral letter, economic justice for all, about the first draft, saying it was the most important document to appear about the economy in the United States in the year that had just finished, namely 1984. So that was very gave it high visibility. There was also, just before the document appeared, there was a cover story about the document in Business Week. And there was a very interesting discussion about what the bishops were doing, being involved in economic justice questions. And so there was a lot of discussion about the document, and it brought about a large amount of discussion, both outside the church and within the church. As one of the consultants, the document was the document of the bishops. It was not the document of those of us who were serving as the staff, because we were meeting over the course of almost 2 full years, virtually monthly, for 2 or 3 days at a time. And those of us who served as consultants would do some work on preparing documents, and then we would sit around a table with the bishops, and they would tear it apart and rewrite it and give us. And so the document in its draft forms and in public draft forms and in its final form were very much a document of the bishops. The bishops were covering a range of issues. Archbishop Peter Rosazza from the Hartford Diocese was a man who had a large amount of experience working in the inner city. Bishop Bill Wiegand, who was the Bishop of Salt Lake City, had spent a large amount of his previous work in Latin America. Bishop Tom Donnellan, who was the Archbishop of Atlanta, had been a treasurer of the New York Archdiocese and was a very sort of labor-oriented, but very careful and very reluctant to get involved in anything political. So there was a lot of division not division, but there were a lot of different perspectives represented among the bishops themselves. But anyway, the document came out and it made a fairly sizable impact in the public discussion. Michael Novak worked closely with William Simon, another Catholic layman, who had been Secretary of the Treasury. And they drafted an alternative document called Toward the Future, which basically was a critique of the US bishops' approach, basically strongly endorsing free market approaches and free market capitalism. But the debates back and forth between Novak and Simon's group and the bishops went on for quite a while. Those are a few of the context framework for the document. Let me say a few words about the contents of the document. A couple of key points, it seems to me, are to be brought to the fore. It's a document on economic justice for all. Now, the meaning of the term justice, of course, is highly debated. It's been argued about throughout the history of Western civilization. If you go all the way back to Plato, you can find one of Plato's major dialogues, The Republic, arguing about what is justice. And justice is a very complex idea, and it's been much disputed through the history of Western and world thought, for sure, about what justice means. I've been in a lot of arguments with people about policies in the economic sphere, and nobody's ever come to me at the end and said, I see why we disagree. You're in favor of justice, but I prefer injustice. That's not the way it works. It's usually that they have a different conception of justice than I do. And therefore, the argument about what justice means is very important. A key component of what the US bishops say about justice, it seems to me, is they want to say that the most fundamental demand of justice is that every human being be able to participate in the life of the human community to a level that enables them to realize their fundamental dignity. I like to call this a norm that can be called justice as participation. Justice is to be able to participate in the life of the human community in a way that enables me to realize my fundamental dignity. Now, there are a couple of things in the background on that. One is that means that the notion of justice being advocated is not individualistic. It's not just me treating you fairly and you treating me fairly. It's us together participating in the building up of the human community and building up the common good. So it's a strongly social orientation to what justice means. So the bishops make a remarkable statement at one point in the letter in which they say the most fundamental demand of justice is that everyone be able to participate in the life of the economy in a way that leads to the respect for their dignity. And then they turn around and they put it negatively. They say that the most fundamental injustice would be for a person to be excluded or left out of the human community in a way that leads to the damaging of their human dignity. Marginalization, in other words, exclusion, either being left out or being pushed out of the human community, is the most basic form of injustice, and that this has a lot to say about the way we think about the structure of the economy, especially when we looked at the United States back in the early 80s, 1984, 85, mid 80s, and saw huge numbers of unemployed people being unable to participate in the society because they couldn't get a job, and being provided to some degree with some relief through social assistance, but in no way were they able to realize their full dignity just by receiving welfare checks. So the bishops wanted to say that the biggest way of responding to the needs of those who are hurting in society is to have an adequate policy toward employment, toward work. And so labor is an expression of my dignity, but it's also a way for me to be able to get the resources I need to meet the demands of my dignity. So justice as participation is very fundamental. It also then led to another concern that has come to be called the option for the poor, or the option for the marginalized. It's a concern about responding to the needs of those who are left out or excluded in ways that lead them to become poor. And the poverty rate in the United States at the time the document was being drafted was at one of the highest levels that it had been in history around that time, and therefore response to the needs of the poor. And they called for a fundamental rethinking of the meaning of human rights in the United States in light of this. Human rights have been a part of the American scene for a long time. We have a Bill of Rights at the beginning of our Constitution, the first 10 amendments to the American Constitution. But the American bishops, the US bishops, wanted to say that there are economic rights as well as rights in the area of free speech and freedom of religion and so forth. And among those economic rights are the right to those levels of economic participation that enable one to live as a human person with adequate dignity. So rights to participation, rights to inclusion. So those are some of the key components, and those concerns about participation and justice for the option for the poor and fundamental rights were applied both to the domestic scene in the United States, in which the bishops had a lot of criticism about the free market economy and said there needs to be a lot more done to alleviate the problems of the poor and of the unemployed. They also said similar things about the international scene, a very strong emphasis on the need to respond to the massive poverty around the world through US foreign policy and economic policy, toward assistance through aid, but also by restructuring the trade that was going on in the world and looking at trade in a way that could help those who are being left out of trade. Africa, for example, even today is largely excluded or left out of the international trade system. And there was then a strong appeal for responding to those needs. I would make one comment about some current relevance of this, and then we'll turn it over to Meghan. It seems to me that these issues are still with us today. The poverty issue, the unemployment issue, and it touches both the Black community and the immigrant community in very important ways. But an area that the American bishops did not address very carefully in the drafting of the document 35 years ago was the problems that are being faced today by working class people in the United States. One of the things, there's an extraordinary book by Ann Case and Angus Deaton called Deaths of Despair that appeared a year ago, thereabouts, that points out the fact that working class people, including working class whites, have a rising mortality rate in the United States. Working class white people live less long than they used to. They're dying earlier, and they're being left out in a way that means that we ought to be looking at the needs of the working class. Now, this clearly doesn't mean that the racial issue has been solved. There's a long problem of this dealing with poverty and unemployment among Black people, among Latinx people, among other immigrants that need to be addressed. But I would also want to say that the broad working class community, including Blacks, Latinx, and whites, as well as other immigrants, need to be addressed in very important ways. And it seems to me that's one of the ways in which the labor movement, it remains very important today. And the American bishops were very strong in their support of the labor movement in the document. But let me leave it at that. I hope that sets a bit of the context. sets a little bit about the content, and let it turn it over then to Meghan Clark.
Thank you so much, Father David. Now, I introduce our next panelist to pick up the story, and that is Dr. Meghan Clark from St. John's University.
Thank you, Clayton. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. It is always meaningful for me personally to be able to be part of Catholic Labor Network activities. In addition to being a union member myself, my grandmother was a union organizer. She actually waited till the day after I was born to come see me in the hospital because they were finally having a vote as to whether or not the library, the school district where she was a librarian, was going to unionize. And so the work of the Catholic Labor Network and the work of making sure that we hold up these issues in Catholic social teaching is something that's always been important in my family. The dignity of work and the rights of workers to come together, to form unions, to collectively bargain, to have worker associations, has been at the heart of Catholic social teaching from its inception in 1891. David shared with us the origins and the process of writing Economic Justice for All, an experience that every time I hear him talk about it, I'm a little bit jealous of just what that moment meant in terms of collaboration. And very briefly today, I'd like to say something on the trajectory that comes after it in Catholic social thought over the last 35 years in the US, but more in terms of what we've seen in the papal tradition, through a little bit on what is often overlooked because of he sits between two giant impacts the church, between John Paul II and Francis, but what Caritas and Veritate has to say on economic justice and labor. And I also want to propose that in addition to what he says on exclusion and marginalization, and specifically on the rights of workers and unions, that there's a couple of places central to Pope Francis's understanding and contribution to Catholic social teaching, which may not seem as central, but I would argue are central to thinking about labor and Catholic social thought, specifically the focus on inequality, often through outreach to the world popular movements and what he calls the 3 L's in English: land, labor, and lodging, and the universal destination of goods. So very briefly, shortly before Economic Justice for All, John Paul II released Laborem Exercens, attempting to develop more a theology of work, reflecting the distinctive nature that work plays in human life and identity, in society. He recognized that work is the key to the social question. And one of my favorite aspects of Economic Justice for All is chapter 2, specifically the vision of human dignity and the moral vision of economic vision of the moral life. And at the core of that is participation, as David mentioned and explained. And unions and labor organizing have always been a crucial part of participation by workers. And Economic Justice for All's vision of participation helps explain the importance of that. But I think there's also something deeper there in what was framed in Catholic social teaching in Economic Justice for All about the positive aspects of participation, not just in terms of dealing with injustice, but also the real flourishing of justice that comes from worker participation. And so that it's not just about fair wages and benefits, but about having a voice together and a voice in decision-making where one works, where one spends one time. The last 35 years, unfortunately, have been dominated in the US by significant anti-union legislation around the country. These impact wages and benefits and protections, but it also manifests itself in the lack of voice for workers, something we're hearing many people push against right now in the wake of the pandemic. And after Economic Justice for All, despite some really heroic efforts by some people, John Carr comes to mind in particular, there hasn't been a significant invocation of economic justice for all and a strong voice coming in that way in developing Catholic social teaching in response to the anti-labor movement from the US Conference of Catholic Bishops in the way we saw in economic justice for all. Anniversaries come and go, and we don't see much attention within the United States officially from the USCCB. The big exception being attention to a booklet on the importance of unions and healthcare workers. Yet in the wake of kind of not hearing a lot in the United States, we've had some important contributions from the global church, in particular from in papal encyclicals that have come after economic justice for all. In the face of the global financial crisis, Benedict XVI spoke to this attack on workers' right to unionize in Caritas in Veritate, noting, quote, through the combination of social and economic change, trade union organizations experience greater difficulty in carrying out their task of representing the interests of workers, partly because of governments, for reasons of economic utility, often limit the freedom or negotiating capacity of labor unions. Hence, traditional networks of solidarity have more and more obstacles to overcome. End quote. At the root of the problem for Benedict is that work simply is not being given significant value. This low value put on work filters through in a low value placed on the dignity of workers who aren't seen as valuable as others in a capitalist mindset. Recognizing the global nature of these challenges, Benedict also challenged labor unions to think more globally, urging that while national labor unions often are primarily concerned with their own members and domestic concerns, they should, quote, turn their attention outside their membership, in particular to workers in developing countries where social rights are often violated. And so what we see more and more in more recent Catholic social teaching is an invitation and call to global solidarity in how we think of what it means to work on behalf of labor and who is part of a conversation about workers organizing and worker conditions and economic justice. In 2017, Pope Francis made a similar call, speaking to a meeting of Italian labor unions. He said, quote, there is no good society without a good union, and there is no good union that isn't reborn every day in the peripheries, that doesn't transform the rejected stones of the economy into the cornerstones. He went on to say that work is a form of civil love, and that it brings the world forward. Right? So this vision of labor as not just being central to the human experience, but also of calling us to embody Catholic social teaching more as labor unions, thinking both domestically and globally. When he spoke this past year to the ILO and decried the vulnerable workers being excluded from adequate health benefits in a pandemic, he once again urged that workers' fundamental right to unionize must be protected. And that in the wake of the pandemic, he decried what he referred to as profits not linked to the creation of dignified jobs. Right? And so we see these themes from economic justice for all centered again, but centered in a way that asks us to think more globally, as well as think domestically. And he offered a statement in his COVID messages last August, where he offered what Catholic social teaching might say to influence how economic aid is being decided and what industries receive support during the pandemic. He said, and this is a quote here, "What a scandal it would be if all the economic assistance we are observing most of it with public money, were to focus on rescuing those industries that do not contribute to the inclusion of the excluded, the promotion of the least, the common good, or care for creation. Those he held out as the 4 criteria that we should think about and how we publicly allocate our aid in economic recovery in the wake of the pandemic. Those that contribute to the inclusion of the excluded, promote the least, work for the common good, and care for creation. Now, these criteria are calling for dignity of workers and the inclusion of many undervalued workers we can name off that we see. I can't but think of domestic workers, home health aides, supermarket workers, childcare, farm workers, and so many whose efforts and contributions to the common good have been highlighted by our experience of the pandemic, and yet still don't necessarily have a seat at the table in determining how our public efforts and our public money is aid. All of this, if we think back to Catholic social teaching, to economic justice for all, is a matter of what are our moral priorities as a nation. From the beginning of his papacy, we've heard a lot about inequality from Pope Francis. And this is relevant for me as I think about the 35th anniversary of economic justice for all, because economic justice for all was largely silent on inequality itself, on the structure of capitalism and the inequality it was producing, limiting itself to strong statements on poverty and employment. What we get in Evangelii Gaudium and basically anytime Francis talks about economic justice is a recognition that the structural causes of poverty require us to attend to inequality. That we have to talk about the denial of social and labor rights, but we can't do that without looking at access to housing, access to land, the right to vote. Solidarity in this way really means we have to think about all of these things together. And while I am pretty much out of time, I just want to suggest as well that this also ties in to the universal destination of goods. A theme which is found in economic justice for all is once again highlighted more recently in Fratelli Tutti as a place where we can reflect on labor rights, and it can help us think more deeply about economic and social structures and a horizon of possibility for greater economic and labor justice. And there's a quote, and this is from Economic Justice for All, but quite frankly, it could have come from Fratelli Tutti. And so I'll end with that. It says, from the patristic period to the present, the church has affirmed that the misuse of the world's resources or the appropriation of them by a minority of the world's population betrays the gift of creation, since whatever belongs to God belongs to all. And I think this is another place where it doesn't necessarily sound immediately like it's about labor. But if we think through what the profound call of the universal destination of goods would mean for how we structure the economy and how we think both locally and globally about how we are neighbors to each other, then in fact, we find that not only is work the key to the social question, but we have a lot more resources in Catholic social thought to bolster that than sometimes we think counts under labor. So, thank you for listening to my thoughts on this important moment.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Clark. We appreciate your thoughts and contribution here today. I will turn over now to our last panelist, Ms. Roxana Bendezú of Pax Christi and Migrant Roots Media.
Thank you, Clayton, and thank you, Father David, Megan. I'm so grateful to be sharing space with you and with all the people who have made some time on this Monday to listen to what we have to say, and just reflect together, because that's really what we need. My name is Roxana Bendezú. My pronouns are she, ella. I'm a descendant of the Quechua people of the Andes, and this is important that I mention because of obviously what we're talking about as well. I greet you from lands that have been and continue to be cared for, respected by the Ino and Occaneechi communities, as well as the Tuscarora Nation in Turtle Island, a territory also known as Durham, North Carolina. And of course, as some of you know, I'm part of Pax Christi, an amazing team of people who have been working on this movement for peace globally. And I'm their program director right now. But I'm also part of this organization called Migrant Roots Media. And Migrant Roots Media is only been around for 3 years. And the reason why I saw the need of yet another platform was because I saw that there weren't really many spaces for people directly affected of all these different issues that we're talking about, and in particular migration, to really talk about our own experiences, our own understanding of the world, our cosmovision, with the wisdom that we carry from our ancestors. That a lot of it, of course, has been erased very intentionally, and to have a space to do research, to reflect about context, about the history, of course, but current issues that we're facing. And so it's been almost 3 years. Our main focus has been to shift narratives. Because a lot of times we find ourselves talking about issues and just agreeing with the premise, all these premises, right? And I really believe that we need to challenge those. For example, as Catholics, we need to start talking about the doctrine of discovery, that has affected, communities throughout the world. I'm really surprised always when I hear that, Catholics in many places are just not familiar with it. And if there are any here, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about it. The doctrine of discovery establishes spiritual, political, and legal justification for colonization and seizure of land not inhabited by Christians. And of course, we also have to think about, who are these Christians invading places? Did Jesus try to do that? Did Jesus say that we needed to do that? No, right? So clearly that has been, our faith has been made a tool of oppression, a tool of invasion, right? And so we need to, particularly as Catholics, we really need to take time to reflect about that to begin with. So root causes, right? Going back to the root causes is critical. Of course, there are a couple of papal bulls that are, have created this. The one Pope Nicholas V issued the Romanus Pontifex in 1455, granting the Portuguese a monopoly of trade with Africa and authorizing the enslavement of local people. And the one by Pope Alexander VI, who issued the papal bull Inter Caetera in 1493 to justify Christian European explorers' claims on land and waterways they allegedly discovered, and promote Christian domination and superiority. It has been applied in Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and throughout the Americas. So to me, that's critical to remember, right? Unfortunately, this hasn't just stayed in the past. It has had repercussions here. I should mention the case of Johnson versus Mintosh, which continues to be cited today by the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has now passed, supposed to be the most liberal, or one of the most liberal members of the court, in a footnote of one of her opinions, she cited the doctrine of discovery. So, let's think about that. let's really start going back to the root causes of what is going on right now, right? This economic injustice that is happening in our communities. What is it creating? Who were the people who were displaced to begin with? And now if we look at the people who are facing those consequences right now, right, for the most part, are very similar, with similar characteristics, correct? So we really need to talk about white supremacy. We really need to talk about this exploding white nationalism that is happening throughout the world, honestly, not just in the US. So let's talk about that. Let's always bring that to our conversations. And I think the effort by the bishops was immense, considering their context. Of course, I believe that more voices of people directly affected need to be integrated in conversations such as this. I believe listening sessions are important, but I believe the people directly affected should be the ones writing all the the analysis to get to solutions, right? So how do we promote dialogue? How do we promote building spaces, building time for those directly affected to really learn about our own histories? For example, I was never taught in Catholic school about the doctrine of discovery. I was never taught about the occupation of the Americas as such. I was taught about it as the discovery. I hope nowadays that is changing. However, I've heard that it's in many places it's not. So to me, it's important when we think about the future and when we think about our continuing analyzing different issues, to go back to the root causes, to not forget what happened originally, what was the driver of what we're experiencing right now, what our communities are experiencing right now. We can mention, of course, the genocide that was committed against Indigenous people, not only in this territory, now a nation, but also throughout the world. Unfortunately, I also have to recognize that the imposition of Catholicism to my ancestors was a matter of life or death, right? You either accept it or you die, as simple as that. And so to me, the only way to move forward after being conscious about that is to recognize that what those people brought was not Christianity. It was not Christianity. It was not the story of Jesus. I completely reject that. The Jesus that I follow is the Jesus born in Palestine, the Jesus that was fighting against an empire, the Jesus who was a refugee, that Jesus who was born in what would be called now a working class family, who was trying to actually, and maybe people would call it violently, kick out the money lenders from temple. And so, we need to have clarity on who we follow, right? And really unlearn a lot of these ways of existing that are not part of the story of Jesus, that are really not ways that need to be, that we need to continue. Individualism, amassing wealth, that is not of Jesus, right? That was something that was sort of implanted into this fake Christianity that was imposed here in for example, in the Americas and in other parts of the world. So to me, looking into the future means moving away from very toxic narratives, very harmful narratives that have created a lot of inequality, that have created this crisis with the planet that we're living through. I believe that looking into the real story of Jesus will actually bring the healing of our planet, our creation, our God's creation, that will heal our spirits also. But that's a different Jesus, and that we need to remember and have a lot of clarity on. I still have a couple comments with some of the parts of the the letter, but I think I'm going to move on and maybe have answer some of the questions and mention those during the conversation.
All right, thank you very much. Let me bring back our three panelists. And at this point, we have time for just a few questions. I ask that if you have questions that you drop them in the chat, because there's so many of us, we can't just call out. A few of them appeared while we were presenting, and I'm going to read off one of them now. Karen Donahue has suggested that it appears that the U.S. bishops have distanced themselves from economic justice for all, even though it is probably more relevant than it was in 1986. What can we do to bring this document back to the place it deserves in our church? Any of our panelists would like to speak up on that one?
I'll say a very brief word about it. It's certainly true that it hasn't received the kind of continuing attention that I would like to have it receive. That's partly because there's been a significant change in the leadership of the church on the level of bishops in the United States. That began while this document was being drafted, along with the document, The Challenge of Peace, which was the US Bishop's major document on nuclear weapons that was also issued just a couple of years before Economic Justice for All. These documents made then Cardinal Ratzinger very nervous. He was worried that the American bishops and the Brazilian bishops as well were becoming too vocal on their own and not simply following the leadership of the Vatican. He thought that this was a decentralizing movement in the church. And he, as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then even more so as Pope Benedict, decided to try to change that. And two things were done. One was the kind of people being appointed bishops changed dramatically. And those that would be inclined to move in the direction of this document were no longer being appointed bishops. And secondly, he took away the power of bishops' conferences to try to issue documents of this sort. It was ruled that in order to issue a document of this sort, the bishops would have to have unanimous consent. That means among the American bishops, with about 300 of them, one bishop could veto the whole thing. So needless to say, nothing much happened. Now, Pope Francis is moving in a very different direction. He's moving back toward giving the bishops' conferences more power, more say, and even more to the grassroots with his movement towards synodality. So I would say if we want to see more movement like this, get behind the movement towards synodality. Find ways to get the archdioceses of the country to really take Pope Francis's call to become a more synodal church really seriously. That means being a more participatory church, a church that's more from the grassroots. So that would be my encouragement to move in that direction.
Can I just say really briefly, it also, I think, one place where lay people have more of a voice already. And one of the things we've seen that is an example of the church not really holding up economic justice for all is the increase we've seen not only in anti-union efforts outside, but the scandal of Catholic institutions claiming religious freedom as they block unionizing and labor organizing efforts in and around their institutions. And this is in massive contrast to not just Catholic social teaching on a global scale, but their own teaching. If we look at economic justice for all, and that's one place where I think lay people can keep economic justice for all as more part of the conversation, because we're the ones who are who are both organizing, but also the ones speaking out and calling out the deeply the deep hypocrisy in claiming that religious freedom for Catholics means you can block your workers' efforts to unionize and collectively bargain.
And really quickly, also, I think spaces such as this, we need to promote dialogue as we can, right? In whatever space we're able to. And I'm gonna, promote Pax Christi USA here today, because I believe that we need to really organize, right? And we need to join groups that are doing this work and have been doing this work, and hear voices, such as, the ones that are here, to learn about it. Let's pray, let's study, and let's act, right? So we need to be organized. And yeah, I'm really thankful for this type of spaces, because it allows for us to have dialogues, and but we can do it at a local level as well, right? So let's try to do that in our own communities.
Thank you. There have been a couple of questions in the chat about synodality, and I think it relates to both or to a number of issues that came up. First, whether the discussion of synodality, how it is different or similar to the process that was used to put together the document in the first place, the letter, the consultations that they had. And second, whether if we were writing such a thing today, would the lessons of synodality give us an opportunity to incorporate new voices, as Ms. Bendezu has brought up?
Well, I'll just say very briefly, it seems to me that the process that was followed in the drafting of the Economic Justice for All document is a good example, in my judgment, of what Pope Francis is trying to encourage by encouraging a more synodal church. It's a dialogic process that took place in drafting Economic Justice for All. There was a lot of participation from people at different locations within the church. There was grassroots participation, there was labor union participation, there was participation from leaders of the business community, there were government officials, there were academics. It was people from all over the board, so to speak, that had a very interesting dialogue with the American bishops. And the bishops encouraged that. And I think that they called it, back in those days, they probably would have called it collegiality, but collegiality not simply among bishops around the world, but collegiality among people, members of the church. And Pope Francis is using the term synodality, which is a more ancient term, really coming from the Greek, that basically talks about the same thing. So I think there's a very notable overlap. I'll just say, let me just leave it at that.
Dr. Clark, Ms. Bendezu, want to respond?
I agree with David. I also think there's something deeper that Pope Francis is calling for, that I think would have to happen in any future kind of something like economic justice for all. And that's finding ways to go out and being with people at the margins more. I think part of the reason that synodality is something that is struggling as an idea in the American church, and struggles, and the idea of something like economic justice for all occurring today, is that there are very few, I mean, it's unfortunate, but the leaders in the United States aren't spending their time primarily, right, listening and being primarily concerned with what is going on the margins of society. They're not out talking to workers, farm workers who, can't get safe working conditions. They're not on picket lines because of unsafe working conditions. They're not really on the margins of, we're in a pandemic, and some of the statements that I've heard, even in, not that far from my own context, show a real lack of understanding the depth of what the pandemic has meant for Black and Brown communities in New York City, and what all of this means really for what the calls for better work conditions and dignity that we're hearing louder and louder now, what that really means. And so I think that listening has to start from the margins in a way that lets that inform all of those steps that come next. And there are some examples. Bishop McElroy, Bishop Seitz in El Paso, right, are ones that have engaged in participation in synodality. But for the reasons David mentioned before, unfortunately, that's not largely who in the last 35 years got promoted.
And I think we need to get the elephant out of the room, or whatever the expression is, having leaders who are speaking against movements, against, the Black Lives Matter movement, against people whom they call, I don't know, woke people, whatever is the term these days, that is just outrageous. Instead of marching with us, racialized people in the streets, instead of organizing, that spaces such as this, instead of really coming out to support what people on the ground are doing, what people who are directly affected by so many different types of oppression are doing. Instead, they're in Europe speaking against it. So embarrassing, honestly. To have that instead of having them on the streets marching with us.
The speech you're referring to, Roxana, is directly contradictory to what the Pastoral Letter on Economic Justice for All stood for. Not just deviation, contradictory. It goes in the opposite direction. It's a very unfortunate speech.
Yeah.
Well, I want to, we're coming up on the hour, and I want to thank my three panelists for their contributions. This has been a wonderful conversation here today. I want to thank the Quixote Center and the Conference of Major Superiors of Men for co-sponsoring this event and helping pull it together with the Catholic Labor Network. And I will let you know that this program has been recorded, and we are going to have it on the Catholic Labor Network's YouTube channel in the near future. And I'll send you a note in the email when it's up there. Thank you so much for spending part of your day remembering the 35th anniversary of Economic Justice for All. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Clayton.